One of my favorite poems is My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. So this is a very famous poem from the 19th century. It was first published in 1842, and the first title was actually Italy. So it was called Italy, and then in 1849, in a subsequent publication, it was retitled as My Last Duchess. And we'll come back to this title, Italy, a little bit later in the video. So in this first lesson on the poem, I'm just going to talk about the genre of the poem, what kind of poem it is, and say a few words about the historical background. And then in subsequent lessons, we'll get more into the actual lines in the poem and talk more about what kind of meaning they have. Now, the kind of poem this is then is a dramatic monologue. So dramatic monologue. There we go, monologue. Which you can imagine an actor on a stage saying or reciting. And in this case, there is one speaker only, although this is really part of a longer conversation. And the speaker is a duke who's talking about a painting of his previous duchess, his first wife, on the wall. He's talking about how Fra Pandolf, Brother Pandolf, painted it. And he's talking to a marriage agent, somebody who has come to negotiate a new marriage because the first duchess is now dead. So that is really the setting for this particular dramatic monologue. It's not a term that Browning himself used, but it is a very appropriate term for this kind of poem. And what we actually see here, if we zoom out a little bit, is the fact that the Romantic poets before Browning tended to write a lot of confessional poetry. They often talked about themselves and their own lives and how they felt. And poets like Browning and Tennyson in the 19th century, they do some of that as well, of course, but they increasingly also spend a lot of time writing these dramatic monologues, putting themselves in the shoes of other people and seeing what that feels like and what interesting psychological perspectives they can provide. And from this perspective, it's also interesting that Browning started off as a playwright, but not a particularly successful one, and so he increasingly switched to poetry. So this poem is really from his early period, and it gives us some interesting insights into his poetic development as well. Now, a lot has been written about this poem, and one critic named Robert Langbaum makes a really interesting point, which is that as readers, as we read this poem, we're often torn between what he calls sympathy, so sympathy, and judgment. Okay, so as we read the poem, the Duke is the only one speaking. We're listening just to the Duke. And so we're going to be really tempted to sympathize with the Duke. That's what he wants. But at the same time, the Duke is a kind of despicable character. We're not going to really like him ultimately. And as a result, we also have to judge the Duke, right? And so this tension is really there all the way through the poem and makes it particularly interesting. Now, in terms of the rhyme scheme of the poem, you can probably see that it kind of has these rhyming couplets, right? Wall and call, hands and stands. So these are rhyming couplets. And the rhythm is iambic. So iambic. And in fact, we can call this iambic pentameter or pentameter. So meter is rhythm here. And penta means 5. And then it refers to 5 iambs. So an iamb is really an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. And if you have 5 of these units, then you have the line. And if you look at this particular graphic here, you can see that most of this reads in a sort of iambic format, right? That's My Last Duchess painted on the wall. Now the second line starts with something a little bit odd, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now, and so on and so forth. So it's mostly iambic, and it's pretty normal for iambic pentameter to have the odd bit that's kind of inverted. Poets often do that, that's fine. But as we look more closely, we see that in this poem, we do have quite a few moments where the stress isn't always entirely obvious. And that's important because the poem ultimately is meant to be spoken, right? And the spoken voice doesn't always go ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. So if you look at the first line, for instance, it really starts here that's my Last Duchess painted on the wall. And so we can emphasize my, okay, so we can emphasize that's my Last Duchess. But it's also fairly natural to say that's my Last Duchess. It's a lot more stresses. And if you change it a bit, then it's more focused on pointing to the painting, right? That painting is my Last Duchess. So last, the emphasis is on the fact that she has died, that she's no longer there. So that changes the way in which the Duke establishes control as he's speaking to the marriage agent. On the other hand, if you emphasize my, that's my Last Duchess, then it really brings out his egotism, his sense of self, and the way he thinks that she belonged to him. He's very possessive, obviously. In other words, do pay attention to the rhythm as you go through the poem because it gives you a sense of how the poem is spoken, what is emphasized, and what the Duke draws attention to, his control of language. And the rhythm, as you'll find, is not always perfectly iambic all the way through, and that actually makes it quite interesting. Another thing to notice here is that there's enjambment, which you can see from this graphic here. You may have wondered why I put that on there. So what enjambment refers to is that if at the end of a line there's not really a natural pause, but the line keeps going, then we call that enjambment in poetry. And you can see that in the second line, I call that piece, right? You can't really stop at the end of the line. And in the same way, it says Frappandel's hands worked busily. There's no pause there. Whereas at the end of the first line, wall, comma, right? The whole thought is kind of paused for a moment. There's no enjambment at that point. So the purpose of enjambment, poets often use it to make the speech more natural. You don't pay quite as much attention to the rhymes because you keep going with your thought, and enjambment makes it more like an actual monologue, more like a speech. All right, so that gives us a pretty good sense then of what kind of poem this is. The next thing we're going to talk about a little bit is the potential historical background to the poem. Now, although the Duke is never named, the reference to Ferrara here, Ferrara is an Italian city, is important, and it suggests that Browning may have had a particular Duke in mind. The most likely candidate is a Renaissance ruler named Alfonso II, and in 1558, Alfonso married Lucretia de' Medici. The Medici family ruled nearby Florence, and the marriage was meant as a political alliance to improve relationships between the cities of Florence and Ferrara. Lucretia was only 13 at the time. It seems that she did not impress Alfonso all that much, as just a few days after their wedding, he actually left for France and did not return until the following year. Their relationship did not produce an heir, and Lucretia's health struggles, she had weak lungs, led to her early death at the age of 16 in 1561. One of the interesting things here is that there were also rumors of poisoning, and although this seems unlikely, the story may have inspired Browning to write the poem. So if you go further down in the poem here, just going to go down a little bit. If you go all the way to line 45, for instance, the Duke says, I gave commands, okay, then all smiles stopped together. So people have interpreted this, and quite reasonably so, to mean that he had his wife killed. He gave the command that she should die because he was so annoyed with her, and she died. Although when Browning himself was asked about this line later, he said that it was also possible to read it as a little bit less grim, and perhaps he actually had her sent to a convent to become a nun. Whatever the case, the point is that in My Last Duchess, the cause of the Last Duchess's death is unknown. We shouldn't make too much of it. Browning certainly did not aim to provide an objective historical account. He wasn't trying to say, this is what happened historically, and I'm going to retell it exactly like it. His main goal was to tell a dramatic story. In any case, I think it is unlikely that the Duke would boast openly about having killed his first wife, especially if he's trying to negotiate a marriage, right? Who's going to say to a marriage agent, hey, I killed my first wife, you really should let me marry somebody of your acquaintance. Another interesting thing about Alfonso's life is that when he was younger, he actually spent time in France as well, at the court of Henry II, and while he was in Paris, he had his fortune told by Nostradamus. Nostradamus told him that he would be married 3 times, and his last wife would give him a child, a son. Now, it turns out that he was in fact married 3 times in his life, but he did not have children. The Duke's second wife, which is what the negotiation is all about here, was Barbara, the daughter of Ferdinand I, the Holy Roman Emperor. So a very prestigious marriage for him. When Ferdinand became a widower, he had his unwed daughters brought up by nuns in a monastery in Innsbruck, Austria. Ferdinand himself died in 1564 and was succeeded by his son Maximilian II. Ferdinand I's second son, also called Ferdinand, became Count of Tyrol in Austria and lived in the city of Innsbruck. During the marriage negotiations, Alfonso traveled to Vienna, stopping in Innsbruck along the way. Now, why do I mention all of these details? Well, these details do explain several aspects of Browning's poem. So, at the end of the monologue, for example, the Duke refers to a statue which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze. Clearly, the Duke is showing off his knowledge of art and his familiarity with Austrian artists. Secondly, the Duke refers to the marriage agent's master as a count, and that comes a little bit earlier here, the count your master's no munificence, etc., etc. When the Emperor Maximilian sent emissaries to Italy, the chief negotiator was a man named Nicolaus Madrus, and his immediate lord was Ferdinand I, Count of Tyrol. So it seems that Browning was read up on his history. Now, Alfonso II and Archduchess Barbara of Austria were married in 1565. Barbara unfortunately died a few years later in 1572, and 5 years later, Alfonso, who was now 46 years old, married Margarita Gonzaga, who was just 15. All right, so that gives you a pretty good sense of the historical background to the poem, if we do agree that Browning was in fact referring to these various people. The last thing I'd like to mention here is something more about this title. We talked about how the initial title of the poem was Italy, right, in 1842. And there's an interesting quotation here from the critic Joshua Adler, and he says the following. He says, Browning's purpose was to convey the spirit of Renaissance Italy with particular reference to the marriage relationship. My Last Duchess accordingly portrays all the ruthlessness, the cynicism, the contempt for human life, the lust for power, and the worldliness that the 19th century Protestant, like Browning, associated with the Italian Renaissance. And I think this is really interesting because it means that the poem is about more than just the fact that the Duke did not treat his wife very well. The poem is also a reflection on how some cultures use marriage as a political tool. So it's really also about the culture as a whole. I hope that gives you some good introductory information, and in the next lesson, we'll talk a bit more about the opening lines of the poem.